Good morning, class. Today we're going to be talking about physician-assisted suicide. Before we start, I just want to get a foundation of what we know. Can anyone explain Oregon's bill to me? Yes?
Oregon's Death with Dignity Act was passed in 1994, and it made them the first state and one of the first in the world to have such an act where terminally ill patients can determine when they die. And so far, 752 patients have participated in the act, and 78% of them were suffering from some kind of terminal cancer.
That was perfect. Now, can anyone explain Washington's bill?
Washington's bill was called Initiative 1000, and it was passed in 2008, making it the second state in the United States to legalize a death with dignity bill. And it was after a long fight of 15 plus years after a 1991 bill was rejected, which would have made it the first state. But the bill essentially uses Oregon as an example and follows the same parameters and same regulations.
It's very good. Now, can anyone in class tell me the third state where it's legalized? Yeah.
Vermont.
That's correct.
I'm confused though because I thought that Montana was a fourth state in which it was legalized in.
Well, that actually is a very common misunderstanding, and I have the verdict right here, which I can read to you. On December 31st, 2009, the Montana Supreme Court ruled in favor of Baxter. It was Baxter versus the state of Montana. It stated that while the state's constitution did not guarantee a right to a physician-assisted suicide, there was nothing in Montana's Supreme Court precedent or Montana statutes indicating that a physician aid in dying is against public policy. Despite widespread public and media perception, the Montana Supreme Court verdict did not establish a law. Okay. Now, can any of you give me some misconceptions a lot of people have of physician-assisted suicide with either with the patients, the doctors, the process, anything that there are myths about? Yeah.
Well, a lot of people believe that the people choosing to die are mentally challenged or poor or they don't have a great education level, but actually 50% of them, at least in Oregon, had a bachelor's degree and 46 of them were married.
Perfect. So would you guys say that a lot of these guidelines that the bill has, being a consenting, mentally fit adult, having 14 days after first requesting it and having to then request it again, that gives you enough time to really think about it. All these guidelines really would help stop people from rushing into it, people who aren't ready for it, who aren't actually legally ready for it, whether it be mentally or actually they're terminally ill. All right, class, now we are going to apply the reading. Now, can anyone take Kidder's ethical dilemma and apply it to this situation? Yeah.
Could this be individual versus community, as in the patient's individual right to choose when they die and how they die, or the government saying when they can't?
Yeah, that's a very good idea. Can anyone give me another idea?
I think it could also be justice versus mercy, as in the law versus the patient's right to decide when, they can mercifully end their own life.
Okay, that's a very good idea. I want to stick with the justice idea. Can anyone go into more depth?
I think the justice side of this issue is fairly obvious because besides the three states where it's been legalized, it's still illegal in the rest of the states. And some of these states even have as harsh of penalties as in Massachusetts that can be treated as either first or second degree murder. But in some states it's just something like manslaughter. One of the main reasons that people think that this is a justice issue is that it is violating a doctor's Hippocratic oath, which says that they have to do everything in their power to treat and keep a patient alive. And one example where the people actually agree with the justice side of this was in Michigan in 1998. A bill was attempted to be passed to allow physician-assisted suicide, but it failed with a resounding margin of 71 to 29%. And the current statute in the federal government is that the patients have the right to refuse treatment, but they can't actually take the suicide stance. So this essentially leaves it up to the states.
Very good. Now, can anyone go into more depth on the mercy side? Yeah.
Well, people have the right to choose what they do with their lives, which means that patients have the right to request their own death. And it's our right kind of as a human to honor that wish and put them out of their suffering and respect their dignity. Also, doctors would be abandoning their patients in the time of their greatest need.
It's very good. Now, can anyone give me a more specific or individual example of assisted suicide? Yeah.
Well, bringing it back to the justice versus mercy ethical dilemma, there was a case recently out of Oregon where a patient was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer, and she actually had to move from her home state to the state of Oregon because, as we learned earlier, Oregon was one of the only states that allows for death with dignity. So she had to uproot her life, her husband had to take a leave of absence, she had to move her whole family and establish residency in that state just so that she could get a prescription that would allow her to end her life on her own terms. And I think that it can be, for the justice side of it, she had to move there in order for it to be legal. But for the mercy side of it, it can be really difficult for someone going through a disease like that to also have to do all of that work and have to go through all of that.
That's a very good example. All right, class, now that we've established that the dilemma is justice versus mercy, I want you guys to apply this example. Many years ago, there was a doctor in Michigan who assisted over 130 patients to assisted suicide. Now later they found out that over 30% of his patients were not in fact terminally ill, and 10% were not actually even feeling chronic pain. Now you could argue what he's doing was illegal, you could argue that it was mercy. I think right now, definitely a hard topic to discuss, because I think, no one knows what someone's going through except for them, especially when you've been told you have months to live and you're in a lot of pain, who's to say what you can or cannot do, I guess, in some respects. I think this is a good conversation we're having. I don't think there's going to be a decision or a right or wrong answer today, tomorrow, the next day, but I think having this conversation really helps, just clear everything up a little bit in your mind. I would say, given what we've learned today, there is no right answer. It's a right versus right dilemma, which makes it very hard and very difficult to come up with. But given what we've talked about today, what do you think is right or wrong?